Mr. Rowland was a man of great wealth but greater loneliness. His mansion stood tall on a hill outside the city, its wide windows looking out over gardens, fountains, and endless rows of trimmed hedges. The place was beautiful, yet inside the halls it was quiet, too quiet. He had built his fortune with clever investments and a sharp mind, but in all his years he had never built a family around him. The only person who truly shared his days was David, his caretaker. David was a simple man, loyal and hard-working. He had worked in the mansion for nearly 10 years. Every morning he swept the long marble floors, dusted the shelves, and polished the wooden banisters. Every evening he walked through the halls, checking doors, closing windows, and making sure all was safe before he retired to his small room near the servants' quarters. Rowland respected David in a quiet way. He saw his honesty in the little things, the way David never cut corners in his work, the way he always greeted him with respect, and the way he never complained even when tasks grew heavy. But Rowland also carried a seed of doubt in his heart. He had seen many men change when money appeared in front of them. He had witnessed friends, business partners, and even distant cousins betray trust the moment wealth was within reach. So one morning, Rowland decided to test David. The vault sat in a hidden chamber beneath the mansion. Its thick steel door usually stayed locked, sealed tight with codes only Rowland knew. Inside were gold bars, rare jewels, and stacks of money collected over decades. It was not just treasure. It was the result of his entire life's work. That morning, Rowland walked into the vault with deliberate slowness. He unlocked the door, swung it wide, and left the golden light spilling into the room. The diamonds glittered like stars against the velvet-lined cases. For a long moment, Rowland stood there, gazing at the wealth that most men could only dream of. Then he quietly stepped back and left the door open. From his study, he could watch everything through a small hidden camera fixed above the doorframe. He settled into his chair, steepled his fingers, and whispered to himself, "Let us see what kind of man you truly are, David." Meanwhile, David began his daily duties. He filled a small bucket with polish and took a soft cloth to shine the furniture in the grand hall. The morning sun poured through the tall glass windows, scattering patterns across the floor. He hummed softly, a tune his mother had once sung to him when he was a boy. His life was simple, but he carried peace in his heart. When at last his steps brought him near the chamber, he paused. The door of the vault was open. At first he thought it must be a mistake. His eyebrows lifted in surprise, and he set his cleaning tools down slowly. He stepped closer but stopped at the doorway. The treasure gleamed before him, more beautiful and tempting than anything he had ever seen in his life. Gold coins sat in neat rows, jewels sparkled in the soft light, and bundles of money were stacked like books in a library. David's breath caught in his throat. He had never seen so much wealth gathered in one place. For a few seconds, he stood frozen. Then his mind raced. What if someone else found it open? What if thieves came in? What if Mr. Rowland had forgotten to lock it? He felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. His first thought was not of taking anything for himself, but of protecting what did not belong to him. David took a deep breath. He did not step inside. Instead, he pulled a wooden chair from the hallway and set it right near the entrance of the vault. He sat down firmly, folding his hands in his lap, and kept his eyes on the open door. The hours moved slowly. Dust floated in the sunlight, and the sounds of birds drifted in from the garden. Still, David did not move. He guarded the open vault as though it were his own life inside. His stomach rumbled, reminding him that lunchtime had passed, but he stayed put. If anyone came through that hallway, he was ready to stand and block them from entering. From his study, Rowland watched everything. At first, he expected David to at least peek inside, maybe touch a coin or two, but David did not. He stayed in his chair like a silent guardian. With every passing hour, Roland's surprise grew. The test he thought would be over in minutes stretched into the whole day. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. Something stirred in his chest, something he had not felt for years. It was a mixture of curiosity, admiration, and guilt. Had he been wrong to doubt this man all along? Evening came, and the golden light of sunset spread across the mansion walls. The vault door remained open, the treasures untouched, and David remained at his post. As the lamps were lit in the halls and the mansion settled into quiet again, Roland whispered to himself, "This man is different, truly different." He could hardly wait to see what the night would bring. The long hallways of the mansion were usually silent at night, but this night felt heavier, filled with something unspoken. David sat on the wooden chair near the vault, the door still wide open, the treasures inside still shining faintly under the soft light. He had not moved for hours except to straighten his back or rub his tired eyes. His duty was simple in his mind: protect what was not his. The caretaker was not a rich man. He lived in a small room at the far end of the servants' wing, with only a bed, a lamp, and a shelf of old books he had collected from street markets. His clothes were plain, and he never asked for more than his wages. Yet tonight, sitting so close to unimaginable riches, he felt a strange sense of calm. He knew temptation could whisper, but he also knew his heart had no room for it. As the evening deepened, he thought of his father, a kind man who had worked as a school teacher in a small village. His father had often told him, "Integrity is not tested when life is easy. It is tested when your eyes see what your hands could take." Those words echoed in David's mind now like a steady drum beat. Roland, hidden in his study, continued watching through the small camera. At first, he believed David might tire or give in after many hours, but David only grew more alert. As if the longer he sat, the stronger his resolve became. The old millionaire rubbed his chin, puzzled. "Why doesn't he even glance inside?" Roland muttered to himself. "Any man would at least look. Even I sometimes stop to admire what is there." David's eyes did flicker toward the treasures now and then, but never with hunger. He looked the way a soldier might glance at a gate he was sworn to protect, watchful, not greedy. His thoughts wandered instead to practical things. He wondered if perhaps the master had forgotten to lock the vault in his rush, or maybe the lock had broken. He promised himself that in the morning he would quietly remind Mr. Roland, but until then, the responsibility was his. The hours passed slowly. The tall grandfather clock in the hall chimed 10 times, each echo bouncing along the walls. David shifted slightly in his chair, his back stiff, but he refused to leave. His stomach grumbled again, but he ignored it. He thought of the simple dinner he had skipped, warm bread and soup that the cook had likely left in the kitchen. Hunger was nothing compared to duty. At one point, the wind outside pushed open a window, letting the curtains flap. David stood, instantly, alert, and checked the hall. Finding nothing wrong, he closed the window and returned to his chair. His face showed no irritation, only steady determination. Roland leaned closer to the screen, studying him carefully. The old man felt something strange stirring in his chest. Admiration was one thing, but this was more. It was respect, deep and heavy, the kind he had not felt for anyone in a very long time. Could it be, he whispered softly, that this man values honor more than fortune? David, unaware of being observed, kept his vigil. To pass the time, he whispered a prayer his mother used to say at night. It was not for riches or reward, but for strength to always do what was right. The words comforted him, filling the hall with a quiet warmth, even as the vault's golden treasures glittered silently nearby. As midnight approached, his eyelids grew heavy. He fought against the sleep, sitting straighter, rubbing his face with his hands and pacing a few steps before sitting down again. The temptation was no longer the wealth. It was the thought of rest. His body ached for a bed, for comfort. Yet still, he refused to abandon his post. Finally, the clock chimed 12, and the echo rolled through the mansion. David whispered, softly to himself, "Only a few more hours until morning. I will not fail." From his study, Roland could hardly believe what he was seeing. He had set a trap, expecting weakness, but instead he had found loyalty stronger than stone. For the first time in years, his eyes grew wet, though he quickly wiped them with his sleeve. He thought about his own life, how people he trusted had betrayed him before. Business partners who smiled at him during meetings had stolen from him. Later, distant relatives who pretended to care had only waited for his inheritance. That was why he had grown suspicious, even of those closest to him. Yet tonight, one man was showing him that trust could still exist in the world. Roland whispered into the empty room, "You are guarding my treasure as if it were your own soul. How could I have doubted you?" Meanwhile, David remained by the vault. The night was long, the halls were silent, but his heart was steady. He had made his choice the moment he saw the door open. His loyalty was worth more than all the gold behind that door. As the night stretched on, both men, one sitting guard, the other watching in secret, felt something shift in their lives. David thought only of duty. Roland, however, felt a seed of change sprouting in his heart. For the first time in many years, the old millionaire began to wonder if perhaps the greatest wealth he could ever hold was not inside the vault at all, but right there, in the honesty of the man who sat outside it. The night stretched on, long and heavy, with shadows filling the corners of the mansion. The vault door still stood wide open, treasures glowing faintly in the dim lantern light. David sat firmly in his chair, his tired eyes fixed on the golden doorway. His back ached, and his legs felt stiff, but he did not leave his post. For most people, guarding a vault of riches might have been exciting, but for David it was not excitement. It was responsibility. He felt as if the entire mansion rested on his shoulders, as if even the air around him was asking him not to move. The great clock in the hall chimed once, echoing through the silence. It was 1 o'clock in the morning. David rubbed his forehead, trying to push back the tiredness clouding his mind. He thought of the soft bed waiting in his small room at the far end of the hall. But then he thought of Mr. Roland's trust. He imagined the disappointment in the old man's eyes if he abandoned the vault. That thought alone gave him strength. Meanwhile, in the study, Roland remained awake too. The old millionaire had expected to see David falter by now, perhaps sneaking inside the vault or leaving the treasures unguarded. Instead, what he saw on the small camera screen made him feel something he had not felt in years: respect. He leaned closer to the screen, studying every move of the caretaker. He saw how David's head drooped once in exhaustion, only for him to shake it off and straighten again. He noticed how David kept whispering something softly to himself. Words Roland could not hear but could see brought comfort. Roland sat back in his chair and sighed. He could take anything. A coin, a jewel, even a small bundle. I would never know. And yet he does not even lean toward the door. David's mind wandered as he sat there, trying to stay awake. He remembered his father's words again, as if his father was sitting beside him. "Son, guard your integrity as you would guard your breath. Lose your wealth, and you can earn it again. Lose your name, and you will never find it back." The memory of his father brought him a kind of quiet strength. He smiled faintly in the silence, though his body was heavy with fatigue, at around 2 o'clock. The wind outside grew strong. The trees in the garden swayed, their branches brushing against the windows. The sound was eerie in the dark halls. David stood quickly, checking the doors, making sure nothing had opened. When he returned to his chair, he pulled his lantern closer and adjusted it, keeping the vault door in full sight. In his study, Roland chuckled quietly to himself. Even the wind does not shake him. He watches like a soldier. Time passed, slowly. The clock struck 3 and then 4. Every hour felt longer than the last. David's eyelids grew heavy, but each time sleep tried to pull him under, he forced himself awake. He would stand, stretch his arms, pace a little, and then sit back down. His body was weak, but his heart remained strong. Roland, too, grew tired. He was an old man, and his eyes were not as sharp as before. Still, he could not bring himself to leave the screen. Something about watching David touched him deeply. As he watched, he thought about his own life. He remembered the many times people had failed him, partners who stole his money, friends who used his name for their own gain, distant relatives who only visited when they wanted something. He had built walls around his heart, refusing to trust anyone fully. Even now, his test of David came from that same doubt, but the longer he watched, the more guilt pressed on him. David had been nothing but faithful for years, and still he had tested him as though expecting betrayal. The thought made Roland's chest feel heavy. By 5 o'clock, the first hint of dawn touched the sky outside. The darkness in the hall began to soften with a faint gray light. David noticed it and breathed a small sigh of relief. Morning was near. He had lasted the night, but his body was trembling with exhaustion now. His eyes burned, and his hands were cold. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, whispering softly, "Just a little longer. Just until Mr. Roland comes." From the study, Roland whispered back, though no one could hear him. "You've already proven more than I ever asked." The old millionaire leaned back, tears stinging his eyes. He had not cried in many years. He pressed a hand against his chest, feeling a strange warmth. For the first time in decades, he felt humbled. Not by wealth, not by power, but by the simple loyalty of another man. At 6 o'clock, the birds outside began to sing. Their voices filled the air, soft and hopeful, as the light of dawn slowly filled the mansion. David blinked against the brightness, his body weary but his spirit calm. The long night had passed. He had not moved, had not faltered, had not even considered. Entering the vault, the treasure remained untouched, but something far greater had been revealed, the strength of his heart. Roland switched off the screen at last, his decision already forming. He could not let this loyalty go unrewarded. He would wait a little, longer before stepping into the hall, but one thing was certain. This night had changed everything. The morning sun spread across the mansion, filling the grand hall with soft golden light. The night had been long and heavy, but David still sat in his chair near the open vault. His eyes were red with tiredness, and his shoulders slumped slightly. But he did not move away. He had guarded the treasures for hours, and though his body was weak, his heart was steady. The clock struck 7, and the sound echoed gently through the house. David looked toward the windows, where the curtains fluttered in the light morning breeze. He knew the master would soon wake and discover the vault left open. He thought of what he might say. Would Mr. Roland be angry that he had not locked the door himself? Or would he be pleased that his caretaker had remained at his post all night? David did not know, but he only hoped he had done the right thing. In his study, Roland sat with his hands clasped together, his mind full of emotions he could not name. All night, he had watched David guard the vault with a loyalty stronger than iron. He had expected weakness, even if only a glance or a curious step inside. But David had given him nothing but honesty, as if the treasures meant nothing to him. Finally, Roland stood up. His old legs trembled slightly as he walked out of the study and toward the hall. Each step felt heavy, not because of age, but because of the guilt weighing on his heart. He had doubted a man who had shown him nothing but faithfulness. When Roland entered the hallway, David immediately stood. His face lit up with a small smile of relief, though his eyes were tired. He bowed slightly. "Good morning, sir," David said softly. His voice carried both respect and exhaustion. Roland looked at the open vault, then back at David. "Why are you sitting here in the dark all night?" His voice was calm, but inside he felt a storm of emotions. David straightened his back, placing his hands together in front of him. "The vault was open, sir. I did not know why, but I could not leave it unguarded. It is not mine to touch, but it is my duty to protect it." Roland's throat tightened at the words. He had expected excuses, or perhaps even silence. Instead, David had answered with the same simplicity that had marked his service for years. "You did not even step inside?" Roland asked quietly, his voice almost trembling. David shook his head. "No, sir. If I entered, even by accident, it would not feel right. I belong outside the door, keeping watch, not inside counting riches that are not mine." For a long moment, Roland said nothing. The morning light filled the space between them, silent but heavy with meaning. The old man studied David's tired face, the lines of weariness, the honesty in his eyes, and in that silence, something passed between them, an unspoken understanding. Roland's heart ached. He saw in David not just a caretaker, but something more. A man who carried honor like a crown, even though he owned nothing. It humbled him, for he realized that despite all his wealth, he had lived a life poorer than this servant. Finally, Roland spoke, his voice softer now. "You remind me of something I forgot long ago. Loyalty without reward, duty without question. I thought such things did not exist anymore." David bowed his head slightly, unsure how to reply. "Sir, I only did what was right. My father always told me that wealth is a passing shadow, but character stays with you even in the dark. I have tried to live by that." Roland's eyes grew wet, though he quickly blinked the tears away. He had not heard words like these in many years. Everyone he knew spoke of profits, investments, or inheritance, but here was a man speaking of character as if it were more valuable than gold. He stepped closer, resting one hand gently on the vault door. "Do you know," he said softly, "I left this door open on purpose?" David's eyes widened in surprise. For a moment he could not speak. "On purpose, sir?" "Yes," Roland admitted, his voice filled with regret. "It was a test. I wanted to see if you could resist temptation. I wanted to prove, even to myself, that trust still existed. I watched you all night, David. I saw your loyalty, your patience, Your Honor. And now, I feel ashamed for ever doubting you." David's lips parted, but no words came out. He looked down at the floor, then slowly back up at his master. His expression was gentle, not angry. "Sir, you do not need to test me. Loyalty is not something I borrow for a night. It is who I am every day." Roland's heart broke in the best way. Those words pierced through the walls he had built around himself for years. He realized then that he had not only found a loyal caretaker, but also something rarer, a true friend. For a while they stood in silence. No riches, no treasures, no heavy words, just two men, one wealthy but lonely, the other poor but rich in spirit, sharing a moment of deep understanding. Roland finally smiled, a small, tired smile that carried more warmth than David had ever seen from him before. "You have given me more than you know, David. More than gold, more than jewels, You have given me hope." David bowed his head respectfully, though inside his heart swelled with quiet emotion. He did not need riches. Those words alone were a treasure to him. As the sunlight grew brighter, filling the hall with golden warmth, the vault door still stood open, but neither man looked at it anymore. The real treasure was not behind steel walls. It was standing right there, in the unspoken bond between master and caretaker. After the morning conversation with David, Mr. Rowland returned to his study. The vault door had been closed and locked again, the treasures safe inside, but the old man's heart was far from quiet. He sat in his large leather chair, staring at the sunlight spilling across the carpet. His hands trembled slightly as he rested them on the desk. He had expected to feel relief after the test, but instead he felt a deep ache in his chest. The image of David sitting all night by the vault, tired yet unwavering, would not leave his mind. Rowland leaned back and whispered to himself, "What kind of man have I been, to doubt someone who has never failed me?" For years, Rowland had lived with suspicion. He had been betrayed too many times in the past, by business partners who smiled to his face but stole behind his back, by distant relatives who pretended to care but only asked for money, and even by friends who disappeared when he no longer gave them gifts. Each betrayal had built a wall around his heart. When David entered his life as a caretaker, Rowland had appreciated his hard work, but he never allowed himself to fully trust. He always thought, one day he will change. One day greed will win. And so, when he left the vault open, he believed he was only proving what he already knew, but the opposite had happened. Instead of betrayal, he had seen loyalty so pure it left him shaken. He rubbed his forehead with both hands, feeling the weight of guilt pressing harder. "I tested the only man who never gave me a reason to doubt him," he murmured. Meanwhile, David had returned to his daily duties. He cleaned the windows, polished the silver frames, and watered the flowers in the garden. Yet he too thought about the morning conversation. He had not been angry at Rowland's confession, but he had felt something heavy in his heart. Why? Would the master test him after so many years of service? Did Rowland still see him only as a servant and nothing more? Still, David carried no bitterness. His father's lessons always guided him. Do your duty, even when others doubt you. Your actions will speak louder than any test. So he continued with patience, though a quiet sadness rested in his eyes. Back in his study, Rowland rose and walked slowly to the tall mirror in the corner. He studied his reflection, an old man with sharp eyes but a weary face, lines etched by years of loneliness. For the first time, he did not see a successful millionaire. He saw a man who had wasted years guarding money but not guarding his heart. He whispered to his reflection, "I have filled rooms with treasures, but my life is still empty. What is the use of riches if I cannot even trust the people around me?" The question haunted him. All day while he signed papers and checked accounts, his mind kept drifting back to David. He remembered the way the caretaker had answered so simply, "Loyalty is not something I borrow for a night. It is who I am every day." Those words echoed inside him like music he could not forget. At lunch, Rowland sat at the long dining table, but the food tasted bland. He pushed the plate away, sighing. "Gold cannot laugh with me. Jewels cannot keep me company. I sit here with riches, but still alone." That afternoon, he walked slowly through the mansion. Every hallway reminded him of David's quiet service. The polished floors, the shining windows, the trimmed gardens. Everywhere he looked, David's work was present, silent proof of devotion. Yet he had never once thanked him properly. The thought stung his heart. He went out into the garden where David was trimming the roses. The caretaker looked up and smiled, politely wiping his hands on a cloth. "Good afternoon, sir," David greeted. Roland studied him for a long moment. He wanted to say something, perhaps an apology, perhaps a word of gratitude, but the words caught in his throat. Instead, he nodded stiffly and walked away, leaving David puzzled but respectful. That evening, Roland sat by the fireplace, the crackling flames warming the room. But his heart remained cold with doubt. Not doubt about David, but doubt about himself, he thought. All my life I believed trust could be bought with wages, gifts, or promises. But David has shown me it cannot be bought at all. It must be earned and freely given. Yet have I ever earned his trust? Or have I only tested it? The questions tormented him. He realized he did not know how David truly felt. Did the caretaker respect him only as an employer? Or was there something deeper? Some quiet bond of friendship? The thought of losing David one day made his chest tighten. He had never worried about losing money. But the idea of losing loyalty, of losing the only person who had stood by him without condition, frightened him deeply. Late into the night, Roland sat alone, his thoughts heavy. He could hear David moving quietly in the halls, checking the doors and windows as he always did, before rest. The sound, once ordinary, now felt comforting, like a reminder that he was not as alone as he had always believed. When the house finally grew quiet, Roland whispered to the empty room, "He has guarded me better than I have guarded him. Perhaps I do not deserve his loyalty, but I cannot lose it." The old man leaned back in his chair, closing his tired eyes. For the first time, he did not think about money, investments, or vaults of gold. Instead, he thought only about David, the man who had guarded not just a vault, but the very heart Roland thought he had lost long ago. The morning after his long night of doubts, Mr. Roland woke early. The sun poured gently through the curtains of his grand bedroom, but he felt no warmth from it. Instead, his heart carried a heavy decision. He could not let things remain as they were. Something inside him had shifted, and he knew it was time to act. For years he had treated David kindly but formally, always keeping a distance, as if their roles were set in stone, master and servant, employer and caretaker. But now, after witnessing David's loyalty, he realized that distance had been his own weakness. He had built walls around himself, and David had waited patiently outside them. Roland dressed slowly and walked toward the garden, where he knew David would already be at work. The caretaker was kneeling among the roses, trimming them carefully, his simple clothes touched with spots of dew. He looked up when he heard footsteps and smiled. "Good morning, sir," David said, wiping his hands on his cloth. Roland studied him for a moment. He wanted to speak openly, but words did not come easily. Instead, he cleared his throat and said, "David, come with me. There is something I must show you." David stood at once, a little surprised, but followed quietly. Together, they walked through the mansion until they reached the study. Roland gestured to the chair across from his desk. "Sit," he said gently. David obeyed, his brow furrowed with curiosity. He rarely sat in the study. It was a place for Roland's private matters. Roland leaned forward, resting his hands on the desk. His voice was low, almost hesitant. "David, I owe you an apology. I told you yesterday that the vault was left open on purpose. What I did not tell you is why. I have lived a life full of betrayal. I trusted people who smiled at me, only to discover their smiles hid greed. Over time, I began to doubt everyone, even you. That is why I tested you." David listened quietly, his expression calm. He did not interrupt, though the words stung. "Slightly," Roland continued. "But you proved me wrong. You gave me something I thought no man could give, true loyalty. And for that, I must make things right." He opened a drawer in his desk and pulled out a folded document. He placed it gently in front of David. David looked at it, puzzled. "What is this, sir?" Roland smiled faintly, though his eyes glistened with emotion. "It is a change to my will. From this day, you are no longer only my caretaker. When I'm gone, this house, the gardens, even the vault you guarded so faithfully, they will be yours." David's eyes widened in shock. He opened his mouth, but no words came. He stared at the paper as if it were something unreal. "Sir," he finally whispered, "this is too much. I cannot accept it." Roland leaned back, shaking his head. "You have already accepted it, not with words, but with actions. A man who sits through the night to guard what is not his deserves to be trusted with all I have. Wealth means nothing without loyalty beside it, and you have given me that gift freely." David's chest tightened with emotion. He had never dreamed of riches. His life had always been simple. Work honestly, live humbly, honor his father's lessons. To imagine owning a mansion, gardens, and treasures felt impossible. He lowered his eyes, his voice trembling. "Sir, I never served you for reward. I only wanted to do my duty." Roland's voice softened. "And that is why you deserve more than reward. You deserve honor." For a long moment, silence filled the study. The morning light poured through the window, touching the papers on the desk, the books on the shelves, and the two men sitting across from each other. It felt less like a master speaking to his servant, and more like two friends sharing a truth that had waited years to be spoken. Finally, David looked up. His eyes were wet, though he tried to hide it. "If this is truly your wish, sir, then I will honor it. But let me tell you this, your wealth is not what matters to me. What matters is that you trust me, and that perhaps in some way you see me not only as your caretaker, but as your friend." Roland's heart swelled at the words. For years he had eaten at a long table alone, walked through echoing halls alone, and fallen asleep in silence. But now, for the first time, he felt the possibility of companionship, not bought with money, but given freely. He stood, walking slowly around the desk, and placed a gentle hand on David's shoulder. "You are more than a friend, David. You are the son I never had. And I pray I still have time to live as if that is true." David looked up, his throat too tight to speak. He only nodded, placing his hand respectfully over Roland's. That day, the mansion felt different. The halls, once cold, seemed warmer. At lunch, Roland invited David to sit at the table with him, and though it felt unusual at first, they spoke of small things, gardens, books, and childhood memories. For the first time in years, the silence of the house was broken by conversation and laughter. Roland knew then that the greatest gift he could ever give was not just written in his will. It was already alive, in the bond of trust and friendship they now shared. And for David, the gift was not the promise of wealth. It was the simple truth that his loyalty had finally been seen, valued, and cherished. The days that followed were unlike any the mansion had ever known. For years, the great house had been filled with silence, broken only by the sound of footsteps in the hall or the whisper of wind across the tall windows. Now, the silence gave way to something warmer. Mr. Roland and David no longer walked separate paths inside the same walls. Instead, they shared meals, exchanged stories, and even took quiet strolls together in the gardens. Roland, who had always lived guarded by suspicion, began to discover the beauty of ordinary companionship. One evening, while the sun melted into the horizon and the sky glowed with shades of gold and pink, Roland and David sat together on the porch overlooking the garden. A gentle breeze carried the scent of jasmine through the air. Roland broke the silence. "David, I have spent my life counting coins and guarding wealth. Yet, for the first time, I feel as though I am rich in ways I never imagined. Tell me, what do you think wealth really is? David thought carefully before answering. Wealth is not just money, sir. It is peace in the heart, trust between friends, and the comfort of knowing you are not alone. Gold can be lost, but these things remain. Roland smiled softly, as if David had spoken the very truth he had long searched for. Perhaps I needed you to remind me of that. The days turned into weeks, and Roland's health began to decline. It was not sudden, but gentle, like a candle slowly lowering its flame. David noticed it in the way Roland walked more slowly, how his hands sometimes trembled when holding a cup, and how he rested more often in the garden chair. But even as his body weakened, Roland's heart grew stronger. He often told David stories of his youth, of mistakes he made, fortunes he built, and the loneliness he carried. David listened with patience, never judging, only offering quiet understanding. One night, Roland called David to his bedside. His voice was tired but peaceful. David, when I first tested you, I was a man afraid of betrayal. But you showed me that loyalty still lives in this world. If tomorrow never comes for me, know that you have already given me more than I deserve. David's eyes filled with tears, though he kept his voice steady. Sir, tomorrow will come, and when it does, I will be here, just as I have always been. Roland reached out a trembling hand, and David gently held it. Promise me one thing, Roland whispered. Do not waste your life in shadows as I did. Open your doors to people. Share your kindness. Let your wealth, whatever it may be a light to others. I promise, David said firmly. In the weeks that followed, Roland's time grew shorter, and then on a quiet morning when the dew sparkled like diamonds across the grass, Mr. Roland passed away peacefully in his sleep, his face calm as though he were resting. The mansion felt heavy that day, its walls echoing with loss. But David carried Roland's final words like a lantern in his heart. When the lawyer arrived and read the will, it was exactly as Roland had promised. The mansion, the gardens, and all the treasures within the vault now belonged to David. The five servants and neighbors who heard the news were astonished. Many whispered that fortune had fallen upon the caretaker. But David did not see it as fortune. To him, it was responsibility. Instead of locking the vault and living in isolation, he opened the mansion's gates. He invited the poor from nearby villages to eat at the long dining table that had once been set only for one. He used the wealth to build schools for children and shelters for families who had nowhere else to go. The gardens bloomed not only for the eyes of the rich, but also for the joy of those who had never walked among roses before. David himself continued to live simply. He wore the same humble clothes, ate plain food, and slept in the same small room he had chosen years ago as caretaker. The grand bedroom of Roland remained untouched, preserved with respect, as though waiting for its master to return. One afternoon, as David watched children running through the garden, their laughter ringing like bells, he whispered to himself, "This is the real treasure." He realized then that Roland's gift was not the mansion, not the gold, not the lands. The true gift was the trust that had been placed in him and the chance to use it for good. Years passed, and David grew older. His hair turned silver, his steps slower, yet his heart remained light. The mansion, once a place of silence, became known as a house of kindness. Travelers spoke of it as a place where doors were always open, where no hungry soul was turned away. And whenever people asked David why he, a caretaker, lived like a master of wealth yet dressed like a servant, he would smile and reply, "Because the richest man I ever knew taught me that wealth is not counted in coins, but in hearts touched by kindness." At night, when the stars shone above the garden, David sometimes sat alone on the porch, remembering Roland's words and the moment when trust had turned two strangers into family. In those quiet moments, he knew with certainty that the real treasure was not hidden in any vault. It was alive in loyalty, in friendship, and in the good one could do for others. And so the caretaker who had once been tested by an open vault became the keeper of something far greater, the treasure of a life well lived.